Hi everybody. We're going to continue our French defense for black series of videos, and we're going to continue to look at the classical variation, which is e4, e6, d4, d6, knight to c3, and knight f6. We looked at this move in the last video, and there are two main moves for white. In that last video, we looked at bishop to g5, and we gave our recommendation in that video. But another major move in the position that we're going to look at today is e5. All right, now here you would guess that there's only one move in the position. Well, you may be right. Almost all grandmasters play knight to d7. That's theory, but it's complicated. There are a lot of different ways white can play that position. So we're going to avoid all of that theory and play a rare move here as advocated by Grandmaster Simon Williams in his course on the French defense that I've been learning. And he recommends avoiding all the theory, leave that to the professionals, and just play knight to e4. Now when I check this with an engine, it's not at all liked. When black plays knight to d7 instead, the engine scores at about plus 0.2. But here after knight to e4, the engine scores at about plus 1.0. However, I'm starting to care less and less what the engine thinks, and I'm just going to trust my own eyes, and we'll assess the position ourselves. We'll try it out. We'll play a few games. If we don't like it, we can go back and learn knight to d7 instead. But we're going to give this a try. Let's see, what's the point of this move, knight to e4? Well, you can shock your opponent. They probably won't be ready for it. But there are some good points to this move. The main line continues knight takes e4. Most people are going to play that, and you're going to recapture back. So what has happened here? Well, we have double pawns. Our pawn on e4 looks possibly weak. Maybe white can attack it and win it. But what do we get for this kind of pawn deficiency here? Well, our queen now has the open d file to pressure some central squares here. And more than that, I think our light squared bishop, which is usually termed the bad French bishop, is much better than it is in other lines. And that's because we don't have the fixed pawn center here anymore. It's been broken up. So we can fianchetto the bishop here to b7, and it's going to enjoy some nice scope along this light diagonal here. It can even support our pawn. Maybe we won't lose it. Okay. So I think there are pros and cons here. I'm not sure how much better white is here, other than what the engine tells me. But I don't really see it. I think black looks possible to play this as black to me. It looks okay, especially with the idea of fianchettoing that bishop. We can strike at the center more with c5, so it looks playable. We'll find out. We'll look at some lines here. Actually, before we look at this main line of capturing, let's look at a couple of sidelines. First of all, if white allows us to capture on c3 ourselves, then that's what we want to do. For example, if white plays bishop to d3 here, sensible developing move, threatening e4, then we'll capture, white will recapture, and we'll play c5. Now, this pawn structure right here is the same thing that arises in the winnower variation, but I think this is a much better version of the winnower for black. In the winnower, the dark square bishop has been given up, and here we've retained it. In fact, let's take a look at the winnower so you can see what I'm talking about. So the winnower occurs after black plays bishop b4, pinning that knight. And then the main line goes e5, c5, white provokes the bishop, black trades it off to double white's pawns. And you see that same pawn structure we were just looking at, but black had to give up the bishop pair. He no longer has this dark squared bishop. And one downside of that is the g7 square is now weak. And a couple more moves here. Main line goes knight e7 or sometimes queen c7. There's a couple other moves as well. But white can bring the queen out to g4 and target that g7 square, which is unprotected at the moment. And this can get quite complicated. But if we look back at the position in the classical, where we get that same pawn structure, g7 is currently covered. So queen g4 isn't really much of an issue here, and black hasn't given up the bishop pair. So I think this is a fine position for black to play. So we don't have to fear some kind of non-forcing move like bishop to d3 in the position. We'll just take that knight. Okay, and then we'll play c5. There's one more move I wanted to mention before we go to the main line. A sneaky, clever little move that you have to watch out for is knight ce2. Okay. White admits, yeah, he doesn't want to get his knight captured on c3, so he moves it out of the way. And now there's danger to your own knight. Your knight can be trapped. For example, if you ignore the danger and you play the reasonable looking c5, then you've just dropped a piece. Okay, white's going to play f3. The only safe square is on g5, protected by your queen. But then h4, and the knight has run out of squares. So black's going to drop a piece. So you have to watch out for that. So what do we do when we see this little clever ploy to trap our knight? Well, we gain a square for our knight by playing f6. So now if the knight is attacked, it can drop back to g5, and from g5 it will have the f7 square if necessary. Okay, so for example, f3, knight g5, and the game can go many ways from here. But if white takes the knight, then this structure is okay for black. Black has just gained the half-open f-file. It's perfectly playable. The engine agrees. So nothing to worry about, but that's just that f6 move is what you really want to remember to get that safe square for your knight if it's attacked like this, if it's threatened to be trapped. All right, but let's go back to the main line now. So I think almost everybody would take the knight on e4. Okay, so what do we do here? Okay, well, let's see a couple of moves white can make. I looked at the database and found two major moves here. Almost everybody plays one of these two moves. One of them is bishop to e3, just supporting d4 and developing. Let's see what we're going to do here. Well, it looks like that bishop may be supporting defending the c5 square, maybe stopping black from playing his primary French pawn break, c5. But no, we're going to play it anyway. And we don't fear white taking it because these pawns are both weak now. And white's just broken up his own center. We could even play knight d7 here, keeping the queens on the board and just targeting these two central pawns. And from here, let's look at two moves. One try for white that grandmasters seem to like is queen to g4. And that threatens the pawn here on e4. And it gets ready to castle queenside. And with the rook on d1, it's going to pressure our queen on the d file. Let's take a look at a grandmaster game here, Kalmov versus Malaniak. And let's see how this game proceeded. All right, so black takes the pawn on c5, which protects the e4 pawn, and it stops castling for the moment. Queen is now opened up, can't castle through check. And the game proceeded with bishop b5 check. I wanted to mention, you may be curious about white's option of taking the knight, drawing our bishop away from protection of g7. Well, black gets a lot of good compensation for that pawn. For example, you can play queen a5, check here, c3. You have to save your rook. And white's doing fine. He can play bishop to d7. He can castle queenside. And white doesn't have any development. So black is doing good for giving up that pawn, or even two pawns over here on h7. And I'll mention that the forking move b4 is actually a blunder. Black wins material after takes, and now either square white moves his king to, he's going to lose the rook to a fork. If king to e2, we have this fork, and if king goes to d1, we have that fork. Okay, so in this position, bishop takes c5 followed by queen takes g7 is no worry at all. The game actually proceeded with bishop to b5 check, and now knight to d7 was played, deciding to keep the light squared bishop. Knight to e2, developing. Okay, and there's a threat here that black is making. He's threatening queen to a5 check, picking up the bishop. So knight e2 actually saves the bishop, because after queen to a5 check was played, white has knight to c3 protecting the bishop. Then a6. Okay, white decides not to retreat and trades off on d7, and then plays bishop to d4 to protect the e5 pawn. Okay, bishop c6, protecting the e4 pawn. Both players castle queenside here. White brings the king to a safer square. And now black plays an exchange sacrifice, which works out well for him. He takes this bishop, which was defending the e5 pawn, and then takes the e5 pawn. Okay, white doubles rooks, and then bishop c5, and black's bishop pair is very strong in the position. Rook c4. Okay, gives black time to solidify his pawn structure. So e4 is defended. Queen e2. Rook d8. b4. Rooks get traded. Okay, bishop falls back. a4. And black gets the king out of danger. a5 is played. Bishop d8. Queen d2 attacking the bishop. Bishop f6, nice battery, mate threat here on a1. So c3 blocks that. Bishop d5 attacks the rook. The rook is running out of squares. It's not well placed on c4. It can't really preserve itself, so white's going to have to give back the exchange sooner or later, and he does. Knight e3, bishop g5 pins the knight. Okay, takes the pawn, gets out of the pin. Okay, queen takes c3. The white king is wide open. Knight takes f5. Queen to c1 check. King a2, queen c2 check, and white resigns. King to a3 walks into a mate in 1. Okay, and if king to a1, then there is this check with the bishop. The knight would have to block, but then there's this check with the queen, and then black is going to win the piece on the next move. So white resigned. Okay, so that gives us a taste of what happens in this position, or what could happen after this move g4. There was another move in this position that was very common in the database, I noticed, which was c3. And I think maybe the point of that is to play b4 and get a nice solid pawn chain here. But let's take a look at a game in which this occurred. This was Benares versus Lima. Okay, so after c3 was played, black tried queen c7, just putting a lot of pressure on the weak pawns here. Queen a4. Okay, perhaps that's another reason the pawn was pushed, to get the queen out here. Okay, attacking the e4 pawn. Okay, bishop takes c5. Bishops get traded. Bishop b5. a6. And the bishop fell back in this game. I'll point out if white tries taking here, then it's too dangerous for white to pick off the pawn on e4 because of the move bishop to c6. And now white cannot protect both the g2 pawn and the e5 pawn, and he's in a lot of trouble. But white didn't go for that. He dropped the bishop back to e2, queen takes e5, rook d1, short castles. You can already see black's game is very good here. It's got an extra pawn, no trouble at all. So white makes a mistake here. It looks like he's winning 2 pieces for the rook by taking the knight. But it doesn't work out so well because after these exchanges, the white queen is going to be vulnerable to a rook coming to d8. Queen to g5 was an excellent move, targeting the g2 pawn and the d2 square, which can be attacked down the d file with a rook, which is exactly what happened. Bishop to f1 protects the g2 pawn, but then a rook comes to d8 and white resigns. Okay, if you move the queen out of the way, you get mated on d2. All right, now let's go back to this position where we've already just exchanged knights. So this is our, strange sideline move here, knight e4, and white decides to exchange knights. So we looked at a couple games with bishop to e3, but I think maybe a better move, a more pressing move, is bishop to c4, more ambitious. The point of that is black wants to get in his pawn break c5 at some point, but if he does it here, then white can now respond with d5, passing by the c5 pawn because the bishop is defending that d5 square. Without that bishop there, white wouldn't be able to do that. All right, so let's take a look at a game where this was featured. This is Mitkov versus Lima again. Darcy Lima, rated 2500, seems to like this line in the French. I saw the name a few times in the database. Okay, so after bishop c4, black played a6. So black wants to fianchetto the bishop and support the pawn or get it onto this nice diagonal. And a6 threatens b5, gaining a tempo on the bishop in order to fianchetto. Well, white played knight e2, b5 came, bishop b3, and now c5. And you may remember I just said a moment ago that white's idea was to push to d5 if black played c5. But he can't do it with his bishop on b3 because it will get trapped with the move c4. So black's threatening to trap it. So white opens up a square. Okay, black exchanges pawns on d4 and then plays bishop b4 check, bishop d2, knight c6. Black's getting developed and has no problems in the position. Bishop c2 targeting the pawn on e4, queen d5 defending it, white castles short, pair of bishops gets traded, and then knight takes e5. So this was a nice little tactical idea. This is tactically complicated, this position right here. But the idea of exchanging bishops was to draw the queen to the d2 square where it's unsupported. So the pawn on d4 is now pinned and black can take on e5. However, this pawn is also weak. And let's see what happens. Knight c3 attacking the queen and the pawn for a second time. Black decides, however, not to move the queen. He counterattacks white's queen. Queens get traded, and black allows this fork on c7 because black, after all, is attacking a rook himself. So kind of a complicated tactical situation. Black apparently had it all worked out. King d8, knight takes the rook, knight takes the rook. And it looks like white may be up a piece here after king takes f1. But unfortunately for white, as calculated perfectly by black, this knight is trapped. Sure, it can get to the b6 square, but it can't get out from there. So white's going to lose a piece in return. Okay, after bishop b7, defending that pawn, that's important to keep the bishop from taking on e4, protecting the knight, of course. White could save the knight temporarily, but then if he does, the king will attack it and there's no place for it to go. So black will win the piece back and actually has a favorable position. So white didn't try that. He just played a4. And the idea here is after taking on a8, white can now take the b5 pawn and this pawn is pinned. Okay, can't take back. So king c7. White takes another pawn here on the side of the board. Rook d8 attacking the center pawn. Rook a4 defending. King b6. This pawn is weak. It's going to be rounded up. I don't think black is in any trouble here because of that. a7. It's very easy to pick off that pawn at any time. Bishop c6. The queening square is well defended. Rook a3. Bishop a8. Players repeat, but white avoids the third repetition. Gives up that central pawn to activate his king. Okay, f4 check, king e2. Okay, black goes back to round up the pawn. And black has no trouble after picking up this pawn, and the game kind of just fizzles out. Everybody trades everything, and it ends up being a draw. All right, so I did learn something about this move, this sideline, this knight to e4 in the classical variation. And if I keep my engine turned off, it doesn't look so bad to me. So I'm going to give it a try. If it doesn't work out, if it doesn't work out for you, you can always try to learn this move, knight to d7, knight f d7. That's the main line. All right, thanks for watching.